Let's see what would happen if we comment out the water service registration. We hit an error when we try to resolve the coffee service. That makes sense. The coffee service depends on the water service, and we cannot construct something that has a dependency on a service we haven't yet registered on the container. Let's uncomment this again and let's continue. Our coffee service in reality relied on two services, an iWater service and a generic iBean service. Let's uncomment this constructor. And in our program class, let's register the iBean service. It accepts a generic parameter type. The only class we have for that is the Catimore bean variety, so let's try that. Let's give this another try. We hit our breakpoint, so this seems to work as expected. After having registered the second dependency, resolving the coffee service works again. Remember, we are selecting the constructor with the most parameters to construct anything. So that does mean that our coffee service constructor with water service and bean service dependency was used. So this works, but this can become quite cumbersome. Imagine having hundreds of bean varieties. That would lead to a lot of registrations. There's another way, and we already know how. We can add support for registering and resolving this as an Unbound type. Let's do that. So that would look as such. But there is a small problem with this. Register is a generic method, and those expect a type as generic type arguments. The Unbound iBean service or Arabica bean service are not types. We could now try using type of, but that won't work either, because those will give you type information and not the actual types. So we're a bit stuck here. Don't worry though, there is a way to do this. Let's comment this out first. We can add a register method on our container that accepts types. So we add a second register method to our container. It accepts a type for the contract and a type for the implementation, and next to that it contains likewise logic as the generic version. Now we have this method, we can write code as such. This should register our Unbound generic service. But does it work? Let's give this a try. And we hit an exception. An argument exception to be exact. No registration was found for reflection sample.iBean service with Catimore as generic type parameter. That makes sense. We only registered the Unbound type. It's up to the container to provide the logic to instantiate the corresponding closed generic type. Let's do that. The error we saw was thrown in the resolve method when checking whether the map contains a key of type reflection sample.iBean service with Catimore as a generic type. So in our resolve method, we check whether we're dealing with a generic contract. And if that's the case, we check for the generic type definition. That is the Unbound type without the generic type argument included. If that's true, we make that implementation generic by passing through the generic type arguments. Remember that previously we looked into the difference between generic type arguments and get generic arguments? This is where this comes back. Generic type arguments will get us the actual bean variety that was passed in via constructor injection in the coffee service. So we create a closed version of that and we return it. That should be it. Let's give this a try. And we hit our breakpoint. That seems to be okay. Let's have a look at our coffee service. And it was indeed resolved again. So there we go, this works as expected. Pretty cool, right? Let's check out the module summary.